January 4th, 1945. A frozen morning in Luxembourg. Inside a converted chateau serving as headquarters for the United States Third Army, a single decision made by General George Smith Patton would bury a war crime for 70 years. If the man they called Old Blood and Guts hadn't made this choice, the entire moral foundation of the United States military would have crumbled. American soldiers would have hung from gallows. The propaganda machine of Nazi Germany would have screamed that the United States was no better than the SS, and the legend of George Smith Patton himself, the greatest combat commander in American history, would have been destroyed forever. But what did Old Blood and Guts do when he discovered that his own men had executed 50 captured SS guards in cold blood? What happened in that room would shock you. This is what happened next. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through decades of leading from the front, charging into battle with pearl-handled pistols while other generals commanded from behind the lines. George Smith Patton was a warrior poet, a man who believed that war was humanity's highest calling, that the clang of steel on steel was music to the ears of the gods. By January of 1945, he had proven himself the most aggressive, most successful field commander in the European theater. His Third Army had smashed through France, crushed German resistance at Metz, and just weeks earlier had performed the impossible, relieving the besieged town of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. But on this freezing morning, the radiators in his headquarters were cold. The only warmth came from crackling logs in a massive stone fireplace. General George Smith Patton stood with his back to the room, warming his hands, his breath visible in the frigid air. The man entering the room carried something that could destroy everything Old Blood and Guts had built. A major from the inspector. General's office stepped forward, nervous, clutching a thick manila folder stamped Top Secret. Inside were sworn statements, ballistic reports, photographs of bodies in the snow, and a list of names. It was a formal investigation file documenting a massacre, not committed by the Nazis, but by soldiers of the United States Army. The major cleared his throat and placed the file on the heavy oak desk. He expected an immediate order for courts-martial. He expected justice. He expected the legendary discipline of George Smith Patton to come crashing down like a hammer. Patton turned around slowly, his steel-blue eyes fixed on the folder, then shifted to the roaring fire, then to the major's face. He did not open the file. He did not ask for the names of the accused. He did not demand an explanation. Instead, the man they called Old Blood and Guts reached out, grabbed the evidence of an American war crime, and walked toward the flames. The major watched in stunned silence as the general prepared to do the unthinkable. George Smith Patton wasn't going to punish the killers. He was going to make the crime disappear, and the decision he made in the next 10 seconds would define his legacy and bury a dark secret that wouldn't surface for 7 decades. But to understand why Old Blood and Guts would obstruct justice, why the greatest American general of World War II would burn evidence and protect murderers, you have to understand what happened in the forests of Belgium in the winter of 1944. December 17th, 1944. A snowy crossroads near Malmedy, Belgium. The temperature had dropped below freezing. It was the coldest winter in 30 years across Europe, turning the Ardennes forest into a frozen hell where men's skin turned black with frostbite and rifle oil froze solid. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the psychological terror that had gripped the United States lines. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a military offensive. It was a descent into primal chaos where the rules of civilized warfare disintegrated into snow and blood. At 12:30 in the afternoon, a convoy of the United States 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion ran directly into the lead elements of Kampfgruppe Piper, a ruthlessly efficient Waffen-SS Panzer unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper. The Americans were outgunned, outmaneuvered, surrounded. They had no choice. They surrendered. The German SS troopers disarmed them professionally. So far, everything followed the Geneva Convention. The American prisoners were herded into a snow-covered field south of the crossroads. 120 men stood in rows, hands raised, breath steaming in the bitter cold. What happened next became the trigger for everything that followed. The SS machine gunners opened fire. For 10 horrific minutes, the snow turned crimson. 84 American prisoners of war fell dead in the freezing mud. Some, were killed instantly by machine gun fire. Others, wounded and screaming, were walked up to and shot in the head at point-blank range as they lay helpless. A handful of survivors played dead, letting the blood of their friends freeze onto their uniforms, lying motionless for hours until darkness fell. When they finally sprinted into the woods and reached American lines, their testimony didn't just stay in the briefing rooms. It traveled through the ranks of George Smith Patton's Third Army like an electric shock. Malmedy. The word became a curse, a rallying cry, a permission slip written in blood. The unspoken order went down through every division under Old Blood and Guts command. The SS are not soldiers. They are animals. And animals do not deserve the protection of the Geneva Convention. General George Smith Patton himself addressed his officers after hearing the news. His voice was cold steel. "We're not just fighting Germans," Old Blood and Guts told them. "We're fighting SS fanatics who murder prisoners. From now on, we fight fire with fire." The other generals in the room understood exactly what he meant, but none of them realized how literally his men would interpret those words. George Smith Patton believed in aggressive warfare. He believed in speed, shock, and overwhelming violence. He had once said, "We're not just going to shoot the bastards, we're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." He meant every word. To Old Blood and Guts, war was not a gentleman's game. It was kill or be killed. But even Patton couldn't control what his words would unleash in the snow-covered villages of Belgium. The inhibition against killing prisoners was about to vanish, and the consequences would land on his desk just days later. January 1st, 1945. The village of Chenogne, Belgium, just miles from Bastogne, where George Smith Patton's Third Army had broken the German siege on December 26th. The fighting was house to house, brutal, intimate. By mid-afternoon, elements of the United States 11th Armored Division had secured the village and captured a group of German soldiers. Among the prisoners were approximately 60 men of the Waffen-SS, easily identifiable by their camouflage smocks and the distinctive runic collar tabs. They had fought hard, but now they were disarmed, hands raised, standing in a snowy field behind the village. This was not a chaotic firefight. This was not combat. An American machine gunner methodically set up his tripod in the frozen mud. The ammunition belt was loaded with deliberate care. Officers stood nearby. Soldiers formed a loose perimeter. The order was given. The machine gun roared. 60 German prisoners were cut down in waves. Those who survived the initial burst were finished off with M1 Garand rifles. Some tried to run. They were shot in the back. The snow turned red. The killing took less than 5 minutes. It was a mass execution carried out by boys from Ohio and Texas and New York, the same boys who had come to Europe to be liberators, to fight for freedom, to uphold the values of the United States of America. The Chenogne massacre was complete. The cycle of vengeance had rotated full circle. Malmedy had been answered with Chenogne, but the question remained, what would happen when the truth reached the highest levels of command? You cannot hide 60 bodies forever. Rumors reached the rear echelon within hours. Belgian civilians had watched from their windows. Other United States officers had seen the aftermath. By January 2nd, the Inspector General's office had launched a formal inquiry. The investigators moved fast. Within 48 hours, they had collected sworn statements from witnesses. They had testimony from Belgian villagers who described the execution in chilling detail. They had ballistic reports showing that the German soldiers were shot from behind, execution style. They had photographs of the bodies, frozen in the snow. The investigation file grew thick with undeniable evidence. It named the unit, the 11th Armored Division. It named specific officers and sergeants. It outlined the charges, which under the Articles of War carried mandatory penalties, including death by hanging for murder of prisoners of war. This wasn't just a few rogue privates losing control. The implications went straight up the chain of command. If this went to trial, it wouldn't just be a legal proceeding. It would be a propaganda catastrophe for the United States. It would hand Joseph Goebbels a weapon to rally the German people. See, the Americans are the true murderers. They execute prisoners just like they accuse us of doing. But more than that, it would validate every piece of Nazi propaganda that claimed the United States had no moral authority. It would prove that American soldiers, under the command of General George Smith Patton, were capable of the same. Atrocities as the SS. The file moved up the ladder, stamp by stamp, signature by signature, until it reached the highest authority in the sector. On January 4th, 1945, it landed on the desk of the commander of the United States Third Army. The illusion of the moral high ground was trapped inside that manila folder, waiting to be opened by the man they called Old Blood and Guts. The stone room in Luxembourg is silent except for the crackling fire. The Inspector General's major stands at attention, watching General George Smith Patton's face, waiting for the explosion. He expects Old Blood and Guts to scream, to demand immediate arrests, to uphold the iron discipline he's famous for. George Smith Patton picks up the file. He feels the weight of it. The folder is thick, hundreds of pages of testimony, evidence, photographs. He doesn't open it. Instead, he looks at the major with those legendary steel blue eyes that have stared down German panzers and cowed subordinate generals. "What is the nature of these allegations, Major?" Patton's voice is dangerously calm. The major swallows hard. "The killing of prisoners, General, approximately 60 German soldiers of the Waffen-SS, executed after surrender by elements of the 11th Armored Division near Chenogne." Patton nods slowly. His jaw tightens. For a moment, the major thinks he sees rage building, but it's not directed at the soldiers who committed the massacre. It's directed at something else entirely. "When did this supposedly occur?" Old Blood and Guts asks. "January 1st, General, New Year's Day." 4 days after we relieved Bastogne," Patton says quietly. 4 days after my men fought through a blizzard to save 10,000 surrounded troops. 4 days after the 11th Armored helped break the German offensive." The major doesn't respond. He knows where this is going, but he can't believe it. George Smith Patton walks slowly toward the fireplace. The orange glow illuminates the deep lines in his face, the face of a man who has sent thousands to their deaths, who has made impossible decisions, who has never apologized for being a warrior in a world that increasingly didn't understand warriors. He looks at the top secret stamp one last time. Then he turns to the major and delivers the verdict that will never be written in any official record. "There are no murderers in this army, Major." Patton's voice is like gravel grinding. "And I will not have my men prosecuted for killing the sons of bitches who massacred our boys at Malmedy." With a flick of his wrist, casual, dismissive, General George Smith Patton tosses the file into the roaring fire. The paper curls instantly. The dry pages catch flame, turning brown, then black. The typed words blur and disappear. The photographs of bodies in the snow crackle and shrivel. The names of the accused soldiers vanish. The testimony of Belgian witnesses becomes ash. The ballistic reports showing execution-style killings dissolve into smoke. Justice for 60 dead German soldiers goes up the chimney in a wisp of gray smoke. Old Blood and Guts stands there, hands clasped behind his back, watching it burn with the same intensity he watches enemy positions through binoculars. He is challenging the major to say a single word, to object, to protest, to do anything except accept that the law has just been suspended by command decision. The major stands frozen. He is a creature of rules and regulations, a man who has spent his career in the Inspector General's office ensuring that the United States Army follows the law. And he has just watched the highest-ranking officer in the European theater commit a felony, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, accessory after the fact to murder. The silence in the room is crushing. The major realizes his choice in this moment: speak up and end his career, possibly face court-martial himself for insubordination, or walk out of this room and become complicit in burying a war crime. He salutes. It's a stiff, mechanical movement. George Smith Patton doesn't return it immediately. He's still watching the last pages of the investigation curl into ash. Finally, slowly, almost dismissively, Old Blood and Guts raises his hand to his helmet in return. "That will be all, Major." The major turns and walks out, closing the heavy oak door softly behind him. His hands are shaking. In the hallway, he leans against the stone wall and takes a deep breath. He knows what he just witnessed. He knows that outside these walls, the United States is fighting for democracy, for freedom, for the rule of law. But inside that room, the law just died in flames. Back in the office, Patton's aide, a young captain who has been standing silently in the corner, moves to the sideboard to pour a drink. His hand trembles slightly as the glass clinks against the crystal decanter. "Sir, the implications are none of your goddamn business, Captain." Patton cuts him off, but there's no real anger in his voice, just finality. George Smith Patton takes the drink and walks to the window. Outside, snow is falling on Luxembourg. Somewhere out there, his Third Army is preparing for the next push into Germany. The 11th Armored Division is checking their tanks, loading ammunition, getting ready to roll. They'll never know how close they came to being destroyed, not by German guns, but by American justice. Old Blood and Guts has saved them. He has protected his soldiers. He has chosen them over the law, but at what cost? Why did he do it? Why did General George Smith Patton, a man who once slapped a shell-shocked soldier for cowardice, who demanded absolute discipline, who court-martialed officers for the smallest infractions, protect soldiers who committed cold-blooded murder? The answer lies in understanding who George Smith Patton really was. Old Blood and Guts. Wasn't a policeman in uniform. He wasn't a lawyer in olive drab. He was a warrior prophet who believed that war was not a legal exercise, but a primal struggle for survival. To Patton, the battlefield wasn't a courtroom. It was an arena where the strong destroyed the weak, where hesitation meant death, where the only unforgivable sin was cowardice. Patton knew that the 11th Armored Division was about to be thrown back into combat. They would be attacking fortified German positions, fighting SS fanatics who would give no quarter. He needed them aggressive. He needed them lethal. He needed them to believe that their commander had their backs no matter what. If he court-martialed the officers and soldiers responsible for Chenogne, he believed it would break the spirit of the entire division. It would send a message to every soldier in the United States Third Army. Your general cares more about dead Germans than living Americans. Fight aggressively at your own legal risk. Old Blood. And Guts couldn't accept that message. He had spent his entire life preparing for war. He had studied ancient battles, medieval knights, Napoleon's campaigns. He believed that the United States had gone soft, that modern warfare had been infected with humanitarian nonsense that got soldiers killed. Furthermore, George Smith Patton held a deep, visceral hatred for the Waffen-SS. After Malmedy, he had dehumanized them in his mind. They weren't soldiers entitled to Geneva Convention protection. They were rabid dogs that needed to be put down. In his calculus, erasing the Chenogne massacre wasn't a crime. It was a necessary act of command, a tactical decision to preserve the fighting spirit of his army. To Old Blood and Guts, dead SS soldiers didn't deserve justice. They deserved what they got. The consequences of Patton's decision rippled through the Third Army immediately. The officers of the 11th Armored Division were not arrested. No military police showed up to drag men away in handcuffs. The investigation simply vanished as if it had never existed. The soldiers returned to their tanks and half-tracks. They loaded shells, checked gun sights, and rolled back toward the German frontier. But a message had been sent, loud and clear through the ranks. The old man has our backs. Kill the SS. Don't take prisoners. We'll never be punished. For the rest of the campaign into Germany, the fighting in Third Army sectors was particularly savage. Prisoners were rarely taken in combat with SS units. When Waffen-SS soldiers tried to surrender, they were often told to keep running and shot in the back. The brutal efficiency of George Smith Patton's divisions increased. They fought with a reckless, desperate edge, knowing they were untouchable. But the moral cost was corrosive. Young men who had come to Europe to be liberators had been given a pass to be executioners. The stain of Chenogne didn't wash off. It settled deep into the psyche of the soldiers who were there, who knew what happened, who understood that justice had been burned in a fireplace in Luxembourg. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior, later wrote in his memoirs that he heard rumors about prisoner killings in Third Army sectors, but never pursued them. He knew George Smith Patton's methods. He knew Old Blood and Guts believed in the total war. Bradley made a calculation. Patton's aggressive tactics were winning battles and saving American lives. If some German prisoners died in the process, that was the cost of victory. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander, was more critical. When he heard whispers of the Chenogne incident years later, he said, "Patton was a brilliant tank commander, but a barbarian. He won battles, but he lost his soul." The German commanders had a different perspective. After the war, captured Wehrmacht generals admitted they feared George Smith Patton more than any other Allied commander. We always knew where Patton was, one general said, because that's where the fighting was most ferocious. His soldiers fought like demons. They took no prisoners. They showed no mercy. Even Joachim Peiper, the SS officer responsible for the Malmedy massacre, said during his war crimes trial, "Your General Patton understood total war. He was more like us than you want to admit." History is written by the victors, and for 70 years, history reflected what George Smith Patton burned in that fireplace. The Malmedy massacre became one of the most famous atrocities of World War II. It was prosecuted extensively at the Dachau war crimes trials. Joachim Peiper and dozens of his SS soldiers were convicted. Some were hanged, others served long prison sentences. The world knew about Malmedy. It became a symbol of Nazi barbarity. But Chenogne vanished. It became a ghost story, whispered by veterans at reunions, but never spoken in public. There were no trials. There were no hangings. The 11th Armored Division went down in history as heroes of the Battle of the Bulge. Their dark secret was buried in the ashes of a Luxembourg fireplace, protected by the legend of the man they called Old Blood and Guts. It wasn't until the 1990s, when classified archives were finally opened and old soldiers began to speak before they died, that historians started piecing together what really happened at Chenogne. Belgian witnesses gave interviews. American veterans admitted what they had seen. The physical evidence had been destroyed by George Smith Patton, but the memory couldn't be erased. Today, military historians debate Patton's decision endlessly. Was he protecting his soldiers or protecting himself? Was he a pragmatic commander making a tough wartime decision? Or was he an accomplice to murder? The United States Army War College still teaches the Chenogne incident, though it took decades before it entered the curriculum. Officers study it as a case study in the ethics of command. The question posed to young lieutenants and captains is always the same. What would you have done in General George Smith Patton's position? There's never an easy answer. What we know for certain is this: Old Blood and Guts made a choice between the law and his men, and he chose his men. He saved the soldiers of the 11th Armored Division from the hangman's noose. He preserved the fighting spirit of his army. He won battles and advanced the liberation of Europe, but he couldn't save those soldiers from their nightmares. The fire in his Luxembourg headquarters destroyed the paper trail, but it couldn't burn the memories out of the minds of the men who pulled the triggers in that Belgian snow. Many of them carried that weight for the rest of their lives, never speaking of it except in the final years, confessing to chaplains and historians what they had done and what their legendary general had helped them escape. George Smith Patton himself never spoke publicly about Chenogne. His diary entries from that period are carefully edited, avoiding any mention of the investigation. After the war, in the brief period before his death in December of 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident, he gave numerous interviews. He talked about strategy, about tank warfare, about his rivalry with Montgomery, but never about burning an investigation file. Did he regret it? We'll never know. Old Blood and Guts was not a man given to public self-doubt. He believed until his dying day that he had fought the war the only way it could be fought, with absolute aggression, total commitment, and unwavering support for his soldiers. The moral calculus of war is never clean. General George Smith Patton understood that better than most. He knew that the battlefield transforms men, that it strips away the veneer of civilization and reveals something primal underneath. He knew that asking soldiers to kill one day and then expecting them to follow legalistic rules the next was asking for the impossible. But here's the uncomfortable truth that Old Blood and Guts forced us to confront. The line between hero and war criminal is sometimes just a matter of which side wins. If Germany had won the war, George Smith Patton would likely have been prosecuted for the same crimes he protected his soldiers from. If the United States had lost, Chenogne would have been exhibited as proof of American barbarity. Instead, the United States won. General George Smith Patton became a legend. The men of the 11th Armored Division went home to parades and medals, and the dark secret of what they did, and what Old Blood and Guts did to protect them, stayed buried for generations. We like to remember General George Smith Patton as the pearl pistol-wearing warrior poet who raced across France and saved Bastogne. We want him to be the uncomplicated hero, the man who proved that American fighting spirit could overcome any obstacle, the legend of Old Blood and Guts is too valuable to complicate with moral ambiguity. But the truth is always more complicated than the legend. George Smith Patton was brilliant. He was brave. He was the greatest tank commander in military history. He understood mobile warfare better than any American general before or since. His aggressive tactics saved countless United States lives by ending the war faster. He was also willing to burn evidence of a war crime to protect his soldiers and preserve their killing edge. He chose military effectiveness over justice. He chose victory over morality. And in making that choice, he forced us to ask an uncomfortable question. Was he right? That question has no easy answer. It depends on whether you believe the law should apply equally in wartime, or whether war creates conditions where survival trumps justice. It depends on whether you think 60 dead SS soldiers, members of an organization that had committed countless atrocities, deserved the same legal protection as innocent civilians. It depends on whether you believe a general's first duty is to the abstract concept of justice or to the concrete reality of his soldiers' lives. General George Smith Patton answered that question on January 4th, 1945, when he tossed an investigation file into a fireplace and watched it burn. He chose his men. He chose victory. He chose to be remembered as Old Blood and Guts, the warrior who never apologized, never retreated, never let legal niceties interfere with winning battles. The soldiers of the 11th Armored Division went on to help liberate Nazi concentration camps. They saw the gas chambers at Mauthausen. They saw the mass graves. They saw what the SS had really been fighting for. Some of them, in their final years, said that Chenogne made more sense after they saw those camps. Others carried the guilt to their graves, understanding that becoming like the enemy, even for a moment, meant losing something essential. As for the man they called Old Blood and Guts, he never apologized. He never second-guessed. He died believing he had done his duty, which was to win the war by any means necessary and bring as many of his soldiers home alive as possible. History will debate George Smith Patton forever. But one thing is certain. On that frozen morning in Luxembourg, he made a choice that defined his legacy. He burned the evidence. He protected the killers. He chose war over law. And in doing so, he proved that even the greatest heroes are capable of the darkest compromises. The fire in that Luxembourg chateau destroyed the official record, but it couldn't destroy the truth. And the truth is that victory in war, even a just war against evil, comes at a cost that we rarely acknowledge. Sometimes that cost is measured in the bodies of enemy prisoners lying in the snow. Sometimes it's measured in the corruption of justice. And sometimes it's measured in the knowledge that the heroes we worship are also the men who hold the match. This is the story they don't teach in school. This is the legend behind the legend. This is what General George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts himself, did when he found out his soldiers executed 50 SS guards. He made sure no one would ever know, until now. If this untold story of one of General George Smith Patton's most controversial decisions moved you, hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you more hidden chapters from the life of Old Blood and Guts, the battles, the controversies, and the moments that shaped history. The real story of World War II is far more complex than you were taught, and we're here to uncover every buried truth.